Greetings, I am Tony Arend, and this is SFS Online and On Topic. This webinar series brings the most distinguished members of Georgetown faculty and distinguished Georgetown alums to talk about the most critical issues of our day. It is produced by the Georgetown University Alumni Association in collaboration with the Walsh School of Foreign Service. And today we have a distinguished alumna, a graduate of the Walsh School of Foreign Service, Kathleen Kingsbury, Katie Kingsbury, if I may.
That's of course.
She is the opinion editor of the New York Times and has fundamentally transformed the New York Times, and she may want to talk a little bit about that. She is a graduate of the School of Foreign Service. She has a master's degree from Columbia School of Journalism, and she has had a distinguished career in journalism. She has been with the New York Times since 2017. Before that, she was with the Boston Globe, and while she was at the Globe, she won the Pulitzer Prize. And so we're honored to have a Pulitzer Prize award-winning alumna speak with us. She's going to be talking a little bit about the role of opinion journalism in international affairs, in foreign policy, which is something that has been a particular interest of late. And I'm sure she'll be happy to answer questions about anything else that may come up with regard to journalism, the New York Times, or opinion journalism in general. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Katie Kingsbury.
Hello, as Dr. Arend said, I'm Katie Kingsbury. I oversee the opinion pages at the New York Times. Thank you so much for being here today. I was honored to be asked by Tony to participate in this conversation. Before I get to the topic at hand, but related, I hoped you all wouldn't mind hearing a little bit of background on me. I graduated from Georgetown in 2001. SFS had taught me, amongst other things, that a career in economics was not in my future. All my parents cared about at the time was that I had a job, which is how I ended up as a Metro reporter in Boston, starting just 3 weeks before 9/11. 9/11 was my first lesson in how vital understanding foreign policy can be to my profession. That day, I was at the American Airlines check-in desk when the crew there learned it was Flight 11 from Boston that had struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center just an hour prior. That week, we spent sleepless days and nights phoning up on the Muslim communities in Boston, Maine, and across the nation. By chance, more than anything, I became a tutor to many of my colleagues on the Sunni-Shia divide, thanks to having taken John Esposito's course, The History of Modern Islam, in my last year at Georgetown. That first year after graduation was a relentless year, and in similar conversations to those we're having in journalism today, I was burnt out. I became a research assistant to 3 professors, experts on conflict resolution at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. I got to travel to Bogota, Rwanda, Botswana, the DRC, Chad, Uganda, Kenya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, amongst other places I'm probably forgetting now. That June, I spent 5 weeks as a parade observer in Northern Ireland. In nearly all of these places, I knew or got to know former classmates or Georgetown alums. But journalism drew me back. After Columbia Journalism School, I moved to Shanghai as a foreign correspondent, taking up again the Mandarin I'd begun learning at SFS. When I later joined Time magazine, my first interview as a reporter was with Mikhail Gorbachev. That job would also take me back to Asia, Hong Kong, India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Thailand, Singapore, Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Borneo. My next job found me flying to St. Petersburg in the middle of January. It was not the best choice I've ever made, to learn Russian. Somewhere in between, I also traveled to Iraq, Baku, Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, Lebanon, Turkey, and across Europe. I was living the map of the modern world course. Once I was on an airplane seated next to a sweating young man who confided it was his first flight. "Have you flown before?" he asked me, looking for camaraderie. I realized it was the 21st airplane I'd been on that month. I share all this because over the years, I've learned the incredible responsibility that journalists play in describing and intermediating the world for our audiences. Being an opinion journalist allows me to use my pen for good and shine a light on the important problems of the day. At work, every day, we get to interrogate ideas, offer solutions, and explore the human condition. We regularly hear from those we agree with and those we disagree with. We learn from the lives of folks we've never had the opportunity to come in contact with before, and we help readers grapple with the challenges of our changing world. I truly believe that I have one of the greatest jobs there is. And yet, for all the wonderful, challenging experiences I've had as a correspondent, I also see the value of hearing directly from the people who live in and come from these places, especially in the world of opinion journalism. As the editor of a Times Opinion, I oversee the work of about 150 people. This includes editorials. This work product includes editorials, columns, essays, videos, podcasts, and other pieces of journalism. I joined the Times, as Tony mentioned, in 2017 as the deputy editorial page editor, and in June of last year, I moved into my current role. In my 4 years at the Times, I'm so proud of all the work we have done to expand and push the boundaries of what opinion journalism can be. Because I think this very much relates to how Times Opinion interacts with all of our readers, including our global audience. I want to talk a little bit about a recent evolution in opinion journalism. I'll share and expand upon some of the thoughts around this evolution I wrote about a few months ago when we launched the redesign of our digital report. The Times invented the first modern op-ed page 50 years ago. It was so named because it appeared quite literally opposite the editorial page in print, and not, as many still believe, because of the outside arguments would offer views contrary to the paper's institutional editorials. Inevitably, however, it did that, since its founders were putting out a welcome mat for ideas and arguments from many points on the political, social, and cultural spectrums from outside the walls of the Times, to stimulate thought and provoke discussion of public problems. And to this day, that important mission remains the same. But it was clear that in the digital world, in which millions of Times readers absorb online the paper's journalism, it was time to evolve and to use new terms to define what we're doing. Op-ed increasingly had become a relic of an older age and an older print newspaper design. So last year, my team embarked on a process to better understand how our readers find and consume opinion journalism. The good news was that they told us loudly and clearly how much they value and appreciate reading intelligent arguments. They told us they very much wanted to be challenged and to discover unexpected viewpoints in our report. But the legacy of Times Opinion also puts enormous pressure on us to be constantly reassessing what the modern opinion report can and should be. Readers also told us they craved more differentiation from news, clarity, and context. In particular, they wanted to better understand when and why we're publishing outside writers, people who don't work for the Times but bring direct expertise, personal experience, and authority to some issue. So we introduced the term guest essay, a label that appears prominently above headlines. Readers immediately grasped this term in our focus groups and intuitively understood what it said about the relationship between the writer and the Times. And it reflects our mission to invite and convene a wide range of voices and views. We also have expanded the bios of each writer we publish, giving as much context as possible as to why that individual has the expertise or lived experience to be a trusted source on what they're arguing for or writing about. The impulses that made op-ed successful from the get-go are still in play today. One is the allure of clashing opinions well expressed. So it is not strange at all to link changes in our design to the quality of the conversation we are having today and how inclusive we are for writers and readers in the United States and abroad. In an era of distrust in media and confusion over what journalism is, I believe institutions, even ones with a lot of esteemed traditions like the New York Times, better serve their audiences with direct and clear language. And with this redesign effort, we have done just that. So how do we work? And specifically, how does that relate to our global coverage? Our mission every day is to interrogate ideas, as I mentioned, and to elevate honest and good faith debate. We believe that is essential to a thriving democracy, but it also that readers benefit from that commitment to help them grapple with the changing world around them. At the same time, we are not unthinking assembly line or disinterested referees. We want not only individual essays to have intention, but also the collective report published over one day's time, 1 month's time, or 1 year's time to have that same intention. We like the people we invite to write essays for us to sometimes be surprised by the offer. We like to experience the same surprise when we read submissions from voices who are new to us on topics we may not yet understand. and always in pursuit of progress, and we're always in pursuit of progress, fairness, and shared humanity. We also work really hard to keep our readers engaged. Opinion writing in 2021 is a collaborative project, one that is dynamic and not static. Even in the pre-pandemic times, the 150 people who work in Times Opinion were not all based out of our headquarters in New York City. The largest group, yes, is there, but we have colleagues in over 18 cities, including DC, Atlanta, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Mexico City, London, Amsterdam, Hong Kong, Seoul, and many others. The reach and scope of Times journalism is quite impressive. Here are the numbers for the rest of the company. The Times operates in 3 main locations, New York, Seoul, and London, with 31 international bureaus. We have more than 200 journalists based outside of the United States. There's no other media company that can claim that. International subscriptions make up approximately 18% of our digital-only news subscriptions, and about a third of our audience is from outside of the United States. In 2020, we published stories in around a dozen languages, and we have a dedicated landing page for Spanish language, which publishes 100 translations a month, roughly, a dedicated Chinese language homepage, and we regularly translate our journalism into French. Now going back to Opinion, we strive to be the most powerful platform there is for ideas journalism, but as editors and conveners, we don't take that responsibility lightly. To champion thoughtful discussion, Times Opinion insists on a set of principles. We enforce rules of grammar and style. We demand certain standards for cogent argument, logical thought, and compelling rhetoric, and we require transparency about the identities of writers and their motives. It's the job of my staff every day to determine what gets published. They take that job very seriously, and they are the best in the business. We hire them because they are highly qualified, because they are incredibly well sourced, and because they have excellent judgment and knowledge on a huge range of topics. Their beats range from health and science to economics, from philosophy to sports, from politics to film. In hiring, we're always looking for the expertise and knowledge we know that we're lacking, and then we ask these questions on a regular basis to balance the output and convene the best opinion journalism report we can. Do we have too many of one type of piece on one day and not enough of the other? Are we totally missing an important news story? Are we covering it too much? What's around the corner? Okay, I think I understand today's conversation, but what is everyone going to be talking about tomorrow? We work really hard to be the place where conversations start and is continued. One of the benefits of Opinion too is even while the news cycles move fast and our colleagues in the newsroom have to jump on stories quickly, we can wait a beat and really think about who could make the best argument on any given issue. And on staff, we have several people dedicated to covering what's going on outside of the United States. On the editorial board, we have multiple writers focusing on the issue of foreign affairs and national security, and some of our columnists, such as Nick Kristof and Tom Friedman, and until recently Roger Cohen, have as much sway with foreign leaders as anyone in Washington or the American embassies around the world. In commissioning outside pieces, we have a handful of editors who are solely focused on working with writers from outside the US. They tirelessly maintain relationship with folks around the world on the ground in countries and are always searching for new and unique perspectives to publish. Any single piece of journalism can take days to months to produce, depending on the timeliness, length, and reporting needed. This is where the intoxicating curiosity of journalists come in. My staff is constantly reading, having conversations, listening, and being out in the world in search of that particular signature perspective that the New York Times opinion section can only offer. You see the fruits of that labor every day. On top of that, we have a video team who frequently produces work from a non-US perspective, or is focused more on a global audience. I'm reminded of our current series, which we call the Fishbowl series, exploring topics and debates popular in the United States right now, but looked at through the lens of those who aren't American. Or the video we produced last year on Bolsonaro's management of the pandemic with Felipe Neto, a 39-year-old YouTuber and humorist in Brazil with nearly 40 million followers, excuse me. Our podcast, The Argument, The Ezra Klein Show, and Sway with Tara Swisher all dabble in foreign policy from time to time. And our graphics and enterprise teams also produce spectacular pieces of journalism, like the project we did last year on the Amazon, the rainforest, that is. We spent 8 months putting together a package featuring more than a dozen experts on and from the Amazon region to tell us what's going on there today and to help imagine a better future. With the help of our art directors who commissioned beautiful images, digital designers and developers who created interactive landing page, we paired text pieces and poetry with photography, design, and extraordinary graphics. One piece of that project that I'm particularly proud of was done by editor Irina Zurek, who is based in Germany. It charts the unparalleled environmental devastation of the Amazon and how it affects so many parts of the world. We also translated the whole package from English into Spanish and Portuguese. To help you find it online, we titled it, "The Amazon Has Seen Our Future." I hope you can take some time to read it. All of this work in different mediums and on different platforms is in pursuit of meeting our audiences where they are and hopefully building new relationships in the meantime. The Times Opinion Report has a very different job than our news report. If the news side is meant to show the world as it is, Opinion works to show the world as it can be, or perhaps should be. At a critical moment when the geography of the public square is being contested, it is also in many ways more representative. Everyone has an outlet, from Facebook to Substack to YouTube. The digital marketplace of ideas is changing rapidly. I see that as something that should be welcomed, even if the volume of voices can sometimes be overwhelming. Around the world, we have seen a proliferation of access and online conversation, but also the restriction of it. What is disappearing are the spaces where voices can be heard and respected, where ideas can linger a while, be given serious consideration and interrogated, and then flourish or perish. American opinion pages can be a place where silenced voices are heard, and for those who are traditionally have higher barriers to entry to journalism. We work with non-journalists every day on text pieces, video, or podcasts. I think of Daniela Lamas, a doctor and beautiful writer in Boston, who began writing for us regularly during the pandemic. We take a lot of care to make sure we bring forward diverse viewpoints. No one person speaks for a country or people, and we want as many nuances and perspectives as possible to be folded into our offering. Our mission is to provide a compelling argument wrapped in a sterling piece of journalism, but it is also inclusion. So to wrap up, a half century ago, Times editors made a bet that readers would appreciate a wider range of opinion in their report. We are still making that same bet today. At a time when the scales of opinion journalism can seem increasingly tilted against the free and the fair, the sober and the honest, we work every day to correct that imbalance. In the mid-20th century, one of my predecessors, J.B. Oakes, saw the future of opinion journalism and invented the modern op-ed page. The New York Times set its path for the next 50 years. I'm excited to have my team be at the forefront of where we're headed next. Thank you so much.
Katie, thank you so much. What a tour de force. I was particularly struck by living the map of the modern world. I'm sure Professor Charles Pirtle, whom we actually had on one of these webinars a few months ago, would be honored. I'll have to send him a note and say you mentioned that. And one other thing I just want to highlight, and by the way, please begin putting your questions in the control panel so we can ask Katie your questions. That I want to highlight is you mentioned the piece on the Amazon that was done. That was remarkable. That was absolutely remarkable. And what the Times has been doing in so many different areas are these multimedia opinion presentations. You know, people still have in their mind somebody writing, and you do that too, but somebody writing something, but the use of photography and music and sound and poetry, it really just impresses the senses in a very different way. And especially when you're dealing with something as visual as the Amazon, to be able to communicate that is just unbelievable.
Thank you. I always talk about, I became the managing editor at the Boston Globe, and suddenly I was the manager of about 215 engineers, because so much of where journalism is headed today is around, the art of digital creation. And that's not something anyone taught me at journalism school, but I tried to learn quickly and speak their language and figure out how we could do presentations like the one we did around the Amazon That was really ultimately, the design was driven by an incredibly creative editor we have named Jasia Ma. But it was the idea of the project was brought to us by our Spanish language colleagues. The Times has made a pretty significant investment in Spanish language journalism, and we have an editor named Boris Muñez in Opinion, who has a small team that he works with to make sure that we're covering Latin America, often in Spanish.
That's wonderful. And also the multi-language approach is something that, again, we didn't see, 30 years, let alone when the Times was coming up the concept of the op-ed. So I think that's been a real benefit. And of course, having languages yourself and doing Mandarin and Russian. What did you take your proficiency exam in, I should ask?
French, actually.
French. Well, even another one. So I have a question here from one of my former students, Ann Pern, and she said, did you ever have opinion pieces that, you may or may not want to answer this, opinion pieces you published that you later regretted and perhaps wish the paper had not run? I don't know if you want to comment or on that one.
It's not a question that I've gotten that question before. We have pretty high standards in terms of pieces. I would say guardrails for pieces we won't run, things that are inaccurate, things that have a conflict of interest associated with it, things that we believe could incite hate. In terms of pieces that I wish I regret, I'd tell you, of course there are. I mean, I would be lying if I said otherwise. But the vast majority of those really fall into the bucket of, oh gosh, I wish I just had taken another day to edit this piece a little bit further, or push the writer on something, or try to create a slightly more original argument. Of course, we also have, everyone on this call knows that there have been some high profile pieces that the Times opinion section has published over the last 5 years that we all regret. So, but that is pretty few and far between.
And given all the work product there, that's pretty amazing. And I suspect anyone that has ever written anything will look at it and say, if I just would have put an extra sentence in here or done this. Now, that's not to say you're not sometimes very happy with something you've written, but every now and then it's like, oh man, I wish I would have had a little bit more time.
Yeah, I think that's right. Everybody has those moments, I'm sure. We also are a deadline business, so yeah, we do have to put out a paper every day.
And I think that's a real concern, because when you're it's a balance. I mean, it's balancing. Obviously, you want to be as accurate as possible, and you want it to be as well written, and by that I mean literarily as possible. Yeah. But sometimes you say we got to get it out, and yeah, we could probably spend some more time trying to wordsmith it, but we got to get something out.
Yeah, we have an incredible fact-checking team, as well as, I can't stress enough, like, the invisible infrastructure that's behind every piece of Times journalism, both in opinion and in our newsroom. We have it, like, there's just these, our legal support, our copy desk, our researchers, our fact checkers, our audience editors. Journalism has, as I said, evolved quite a bit since I became a reporter back in 2001. And we couldn't do it every day without those folks who never have their byline in the paper, or who rarely have their byline in the paper, I should say, but who are essential to our journalism.
How do you see, so I'm going to ask a question, because when I was in student at Georgetown, back when John Carroll was still teaching there, not quite that long ago, but when I was a student, there was a clear sense of authoritative sources. And the New York Times was certainly one of those, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and we could go on. But there was a sense when any student was doing research, he or she always knew the credible sources. Now, that's not to say that anybody couldn't have made a mistake, even back then. Certainly mistakes were made, and frankly, the staffs weren't as big, and you didn't have as many fact checkers and everything else. But the challenge I see today is with students that are younger, so elementary school, middle school students, not being taught the sort of sense of authoritative sources. How does the Times sort of address that issue, and what kind of challenges do you see?
Well, first and foremost, we have an incredible program that offers access to Times journalism to both middle schoolers and high schoolers. It's largely actually driven by philanthropy from our readers. That's a very helpful way to increase news literacy. There's an incredible project that I volunteered for when I was a younger journalist called the News Literacy Project, that goes into schools and explains how newspapers and other news organizations work. And so I do think that there is some onus on us on terms of trying to teach young people the value of our news journalism. I think it also just puts a huge pressure on us to make sure we get things right, and make sure that as often as we possibly can, we are upholding the standards that we try to hold ourselves to every day, and to maintain our independence. One of the things that I constantly stress to my staff is the fact that we don't represent any political party. We need to be independent moderators of open and honest debate. And then I think that you're right. We've seen just this erosion of trust in expertise. I mean, not only from students, but from adults, right, in many ways. And so whatever we can do to try to combat that mistrust and to explain very clearly and transparently how we do our craft to as many audiences as we possibly can, I think has a real benefit.
I think that makes sense. And the outreach to middle school, that's very important, because that's kind of where people start to form their ideas about what they're going to trust and what they're not going to trust. And I'm always amazed that to this day, people will send notes or something to me where it's clearly fallacious, but it seems to have some legitimacy because it was found on a website somewhere. And we all know that anything could be on a website somewhere.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
It's on a website somewhere. Recently, it was disclosed that the Justice Department, under Attorney General Barr, had been engaging in, I guess, issuing subpoenas to not just to journalists, but to Don McGahn and to Congress people. But a number of journalists came out in that as well. I know Barbara Starr, for example, in CNN was specifically targeted. And I understand others were as well. Do you see this as a trend, or really any kind of comments that you would have on that? Because I personally, as an academic, found it extraordinarily disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely troubling. And I do think it's a trend. And I think it's a trend that actually started in the Obama administration that we saw continue, really, actually, though, to heights that we could not have even imagined under the Trump administration. I mean, one of the most telling things I saw from some of those disclosures was the fact that Trump went after the reporters at the Times, at the Washington Post, at CNN, who were his biggest, who were really unearthing information about his White House and his administration. And essentially, we're trying to silence them. And I think that goes back to what I was talking about before, about the importance of having legal representation and legal representation that you can really trust. David McCraw, who is the Times General Counsel, Associate General Counsel, is one of the country's foremost, really the world's foremost experts on First Amendment law, and he represented the Times, obviously, in this matter and many, many others. We feel confident that we are hearing right now the right things from the Biden administration in terms of steps they are taking to try to prevent this kind of intrusion on a free press. But really, the number one thing we are pressing for and we think is needed is a federal shield law coming from Congress.
And that, I think that would make good sense. We've come up upon the anniversary of the Pentagon Papers. And that obviously was a major victory for the First Amendment, and very specifically a victory for the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I know in the celebrations, if you will, over the anniversary, a lot of people have questioned whether the Supreme Court today would be as staunchly supportive of the First Amendment as it was in 1971. I don't know if you have any ideas or observations. It's always hard to predict the Supreme Court.
I was going to say, I mean, it's very hard to know how this court would react to the kind of challenges that the court saw with the Pentagon Papers. Mostly because, as we've seen, you know, it's very hard to predict how the current court is going to rule on anything beyond perhaps maybe abortion rights. But I do think that we have seen it's quite scary, actually. We've seen time after time intrusion on you know, the right to a free press, the right of association, the right of free speech generally in the United States. And we have seen courts make decisions that we have challenged ourselves. And you know, there's a lot that remains to be seen over the next few years as to how the court responds to some of these legal suits.
I was very heartened to see the decision today on the Cheerleader case because the vote was 8-1, affirming the right of the young cheerleader to do what she had done, and basically, which I will not quote here, but basically affirming the fact that public schools did not have the authority to ban that speech because that was seen as free speech. And Justice Breyer wrote, I thought, a brilliant opinion for the court. And again, 8-1 is about as Thomas dissented, but that's about as strong. You know, that when you get that, you're in pretty good shape.
Yeah, I think that's right. I haven't had a chance to read the opinion, if I'm honest, but I've read the news coverage of it, and I do think that's a good sign. I also think that we didn't know what to expect in that case, and that's just another example of you know, this court being fairly unpredictable at this point.
I think you're right. I listened to some of the oral argument, and I'm not fully surprised, but even based on the oral argument, you couldn't predict what was going to happen.
Exactly.
So we have a question here from Joshua Smith, and this is an interesting question. He's asking, what is your response to recent criticisms of the division between the newsroom and the opinion section, and sort of some of the tension that exists there, and he doesn't say this, but whether there is discussion about that relationship, or whether there should be some revisiting of that. And I know that the same issue comes up with respect to, say, certain cable stations, where the opinion section is very different from the news section.
Yeah, I mean, the Times believes very firmly that there should be a wall between news and opinion. It's something that has always been part of the Times tradition. We do that primarily for, you know, to reaffirm our independence, and we do that to protect our news colleagues, for sure. So, for instance, no news reporter knows what's happening in opinion and does not, you know, interact with us on editorials, for instance. And then at the same time, we're not involved in the news production, and that gives us the ability to say what we need to say in the opinion report and to explore different ideas that may run contrary to some of the news reporting that we have. I don't mean to suggest we are running anything that undercuts our news report. We, of course, have a very collegial relationship with our news colleagues. What I'm trying to say is that that independence kind of affords us both the ability to do our jobs as to the best of our ability.
And that makes sense. I feel like it's dealt with better in newspapers than it might very well be in, say, television or broadcast or cable stations, because there's a lot of criticism when, I'll put it this way, when you read the New York Times, you know what it is that you're reading. In other words, you know that it's either news, or if it's an opinion piece, you know that's what it is. And I think with some of the cable stations, there's a blurring of the line. It's unclear.
Yeah, I'm often asked about opinion in the news report, and my response always is, you know, that's not my lane. You know, I focus on opinion. My job is pretty clear in terms of what we do. You know, I will I will emphasize, however, that a lot of journalism in the way we think of traditional journalism goes into every opinion piece. There's a lot of reporting behind pretty much all of the work that we do. And so the distinction is not in terms of journalism, the distinction is on the emphasis of whether or not we're making a clear argument versus trying to report the news with an open mind.
And that makes sense. One thing we've also seen over the past, well, 15, 20 years is a diversity of opinion on the opinion pages. And the Amazon piece is a good example of that. But maybe give us some insight as to what you all do to make sure you get that kind of diverse voice.
Yeah, this is a huge emphasis of the work that we do. So it really started with the advent of the op-ed page in the Times back in 1970. The point of from the beginning, the point was to present this wide range of voices and views. And we carry on that. One of the things that we've done in the last few months is actually another design change, which is to include a module in most of our pieces that explain. I'll just give a recent example. For instance, when the Israel-Palestinian conflict was going on, we made sure that people understood that we were publishing pieces that came from every angle in that conflict, that were trying to produce nuance. I mean, I always say, if there's any place for nuance, it's on the editorial page of the New York Times. And, you know, I think that also, and so those modules explain, you know, all the different views that we're bringing to the piece, but also ultimately, we want people to feel like they have had a lot of different inputs when they're making up their own mind. We want to help people make up their own minds.
Let me ask, this might be a bit of an unfair question, but
Okay.
when you read other newspapers, what are your go-to, aside from the New York Times? What are your go-to, and I think internationally too, because this is when I'll put it when we advise students, and we say you're a student in the School of Foreign Service and you want to do something in international affairs, you should read the following news sources.
Sure.
Now we say stuff like The Economist, which is a little bit different. What would be your advice? What would be the sort of, aside from the New York Times, the sources you would recommend, not just to students, but to really anyone who wants to educate himself or herself a little bit more about foreign affairs?
It's a great question. I'm a former business reporter, so I actually love the FT. If I could, I'd have the FT delivered to my house every single day. Unfortunately, they won't do that for me, but I'm still pressing on them. I grew up in a house. My dad was actually a retailer, not a journalist, but we got 5 newspapers a day, mostly because he wanted to look at the ads. So I grew up reading a lot of different news sources. I think The Economist is a great example of opinion journalism, actually. Their leaders are front and center, still amongst the best that there are, from covering foreign issues. I think the Washington Post does a great job. Their global opinion section there, led by Karen Attiya, is very strong. I think there's some great coverage of Asia by the Los Angeles Times. You know, there's so much good stuff out there right now. You know, from Substacks to more traditional papers. I am also a big fan of some of the papers, and doesn't cover foreign policy, but papers like the Kansas City Star, which does a really great opinion section every day. I'm telling you a lot of newspapers, but that happens to just be my world. No, I still think the Guardian does terrific journalism. Yeah, I think there's so many options. I think the biggest thing is, and I'll just be frank, I mean, one of my biggest news sources every day is Twitter, and that just introduces me to a wide variety. I mean, stay off of Twitter. No one should be on Twitter if you can help it, because it becomes a total mind suck and it can create a vacuum. But I am constantly introduced to news sources that I'm not familiar with, particularly abroad, and I try to constantly educate myself about what I should be reading.
You know, the advantage to Twitter, and it's like anything. It's a blessing and it's a curse, and it can be used for good, it can be used for bad, whatever. But the thing I find most useful about Twitter is, if you will, and I hate the way the term breaking news is developed, but when something is truly breaking, is just happening, before anybody's had a chance to put a news story together,
Right.
you'll see it on Twitter. And it could be everything, you know, from the standpoint of we're hearing rockets out of Gaza to somebody died or whatever it is. And that signals to me to then go to the legitimate sources. It's like, oh, is the Times writing about this now? Or depending on where it is, you know, if it's something in Paris, is Le Monde writing about it? So, but I find that very good in hearing about things that are, including local things like you know, a bridge, pedestrian walkway collapsed about an hour or so ago in Washington, D.C.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah,
Gosh.
yeah. A couple people were hurt, but apparently not seriously. So you start to hear about those things. You can go to Twitter. So
I think it's all about having a healthy diet when it comes to social media. But I agree with you. I do think that that is one of the best utilities of Twitter. And I also should have mentioned, I find that the Wall Street Journal's news section does excellent international coverage still.
Absolutely. There used to be so many more papers that had international bureaus. Baltimore Sun had a notable.
The Boston Globe also had it.
Absolutely, one of the best. Chicago Tribune. One of the sad things, and we're running up on time, but I want to raise this because this is something that troubles me personally, and would love to hear what you think. One of the sad things is, and you mentioned Kansas City, is the closing of so many local newspapers and news outlets, and the reliance therefore on the broader, the global, or in the alternative, the social media. You know, if somebody grew up in a particular place, they might get a, you know, if you grew up in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, you'd get the Evening Capital, the Baltimore Sun, and the Evening News American. You get all these different things, and they keep us. Any comments you would have on that? Because I see that as a real sad development.
I mean, it's absolutely devastating. It's devastating for the public. It's devastating for our industry. It's devastating for the New York Times, because we used to rely on those local papers for a lot of talent pipelines. But I think that if there's any sliver of hope, it's that we've seen a lot of local journalism startups come through, and they're not traditional newspapers. Sometimes they often cover a single issue. But I'm thinking of places like Mississippi Today, or The City in New York City, or MLK 50 in Memphis. A variety, I could keep naming them, that are really, really focused on individual communities and holding government officials there accountable. And I'm hopeful. We've seen a couple of other startups that are looking at it more nationally. And I'm hopeful that we start reinventing new versions of what the local newspaper used to be, because honestly, I don't know how democracy continues if you don't have a strong local media landscape.
So what you just said, you don't know how democracy continues if you don't have a strong local media landscape. I think that's something that concerns a lot of us. But you said, I mean,
it's the corruption that could thrive. The level of abuse of power, you know, there's just so many ways that local journalists, like my former colleagues at the Globe, every single day uncover that, you know, it does scare me that there aren't people in every state house today making sure that power is held to account. It just is scary. And so I try to focus on the positive, you know, things like the Texas Tribune in Austin, Texas, really paying attention to power in that state capital. But, you know, it's hard to know where the future is headed there. I guess it's definitely up in the air.
Well, we're essentially out of time, and I don't want to let it end with it being up in the air, although if it is, but I do want to give you the final word, Katie. Any sort of final comments you would have, either about sort of the future of the Times, opinion journalism, or advice that you might give to our audience out there? Any final words of wisdom, and we'll end on that.
Read the New York Times, subscribe to the New York Times, help us keep doing our jobs. Let us know when we're not doing our jobs well. We welcome feedback. But most important, subscribe to your local newspaper and read that every day too.
All right. On that word of wisdom, and I do subscribe to the New York Times. I do, and I read it regularly. Do that. And let's thank Katie so much for a fantastic explication of everything she's doing. And again, your career evolution, I think, is such a wonderful message to anybody else out there who's either thinking of a career in journalism or in foreign affairs. And living the map of the modern world is going to be one of my major takeaways. So thank you very much. And I want to thank our audience. Special thanks to Bridget Holmes, who was helping us out with the technology on this, and to Eleanor Monty Jones, who conceived of this idea of SFS Online and On Topic. And we will see you next time. Again, shout out to Katie Kingsbury. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.